Hoşçakalın, and this is Trope Talk, Unreliable Narrators by channel Oli Sarcastic Proxon. Surprise! Narration is subjective. Narrative voice always carries an implied character with it, and sometimes narrators are biased, confused, or big old liars. Well, I guess it depends. Narrator is like a broad term. Narrators can be anything. Narrators can be story itself. Narrators can be the protagonist. Narrator can be, anything, right? Narrators could be somebody who's just like you, who goes to journey alongside you, which can also have biases or something. Makes sense. So this is going to be fun. I love Trope Talk. I love how, OSP, I don't think I've ever come across any other channel who talks like this about tropes. Maybe there is, but I haven't found it. So I like this particular topic, who talks about different tropes, right? Basically, this is the thing we feel, but can't really put our finger to it unless, somebody like, Red here explaining that in detail as a topic. So it's always fun to watch. Let's watch it.
Every story with a narrator has a narrative voice. In simple terms, it's the tone and approach taken by the narration, which is basically all the parts of the story that aren't dialogue or inner monologue. Scene setting, physical descriptions, the actions a character takes, all these things make up the narrative voice of a typical prose story. The simplest thing to nail down about it is whether it's in first, second, or third person. A first-person narrative voice talks in terms of I and we and me, taking the explicit role of a character in the story, retelling events that happened to them. A second-person narrative voice is more rare, talking in terms of you and yours, taking the role of an observer, describing the actions of the person they're dealing with. A third-person narrative voice is probably the most common, using they and them and he and her to describe the actions of the characters from a wholly externalized perspective. A second or third-person narration essentially implies the existence of a narrator character, intangible and unobservable, narrating the events of the story and the thoughts and insights of its characters from a separated standpoint. And this is a very useful subdivision to draw, but it is not where the conversation about narrative voice ends. For one thing, these implied spectator mode narrator characters have varying levels of omniscience, how much they actually know about the story and can communicate to the audience. Limited is probably the narrowest field of view.
I guess it depends. If the story has already happened and somebody's telling us a story, obviously the narrator is telling the story and the narrator already knows what happened.
Narrative voice is limited to the thoughts and inner monologue of one character at a time, but will limit its narration of all other characters to the POV character's own observations. For instance, a third-person limited narrator might volunteer that the POV character is feeling tired or scared, but when discussing a different character, the narrator will only volunteer that the POV character thinks they're putting on a brave face. Objective is the narrative equivalent of a wide shot. This narrator doesn't have close-in access to anyone's thoughts and motivations and will instead simply narrate their actions in dialogue, leaving the audience to infer how they're feeling and why they're doing the things that they're doing. And finally,
basically that's the type of narrator that is on a journey along with audience themselves, because they don't know what's happening. Just like the audience, they don't know what they're feeling or what's going to happen, but they're just like, even they can be surprised, right? Even with the narrator voice, it's a surprise there.
Omniscient is a narrative voice that knows what everyone is thinking and feeling, and can freely switch perspectives between different characters to show what anyone and everyone is feeling about the story. This might seem like a lot of trouble for a character that doesn't even really exist. Narration is invisible, the glue that holds prose storytelling together, because otherwise it would just be scripted dialogue and stage directions. Narration is how the story describes itself, and because there's no way for language to be completely neutral and objective, the choices a writer makes in how a narrator, even a third-person omniscient narrator, describes the story they're dealing with implicitly creates a characterization for that narrator. There's a difference between saying a character said something and saying they hissed or murmured or managed or yelled or shrieked. They all feel different and mean different things and imply different things about the character they're describing, and thus indirectly imply things about the narrator holding that opinion. A supposedly distant narrator might describe a character as beautiful or repulsive or terrifying or irresistibly attractive, with the implication that these opinions must be universally held because they're being stated by a character that's supposed to be neutral, despite the fact that these are subjective assessments that would vary from character to character and audience to audience.
Yeah, but I think it's like, it's the storyteller, right? Like if this omniscient narrator who knows everything, which basically story itself, let's be honest, not some character, story itself is narrating. That's how you could take it, because it knows everything, knows who's feeling what. And if subjective things are said by their story, I guess that's how we're supposed to approach the story in the first place, because it's a story that being said, and whoever is saying the story is implying those things. So we just have to take that at their word, I guess, at that point, even though it's subjective.
If a writer isn't careful about this, the narrator can end up as an unintentional and invisible author self-insert, giving the writer's unfiltered perspective on the story they're telling, perhaps revealing implicit biases or blind spots on the part of the storyteller. But the thing is, this is a feature and not a bug. A completely neutral narrator, if such a thing could even exist, would be distant and sterile and make the story needlessly difficult to parse. The fact is, the narrator is a character, and that character has a voice. And while some stories make that explicit by having the narrator be one of the named characters recounting the story from their perspective, some story formats make this less obvious, and the characterization of the narrator is really only demonstrated in the specific ways they choose to describe the plot and characters. The narrative voice has opinions and biases and finds certain things funny or worth pointing out, while others might be glossed over as irrelevant. In a medium with an
but nowadays there are narrators who explain these biases as something funny or sarcastic, implying that this is literally their take and you shouldn't take that too much seriously or something, right? Say that in jokingly angry way or sarcastic way automatically implies to people like he's having feeling about it, not that this is a fact or something.
the narrator becomes a lens through which the audience experiences the thoughts and actions of every other character. Which means, on the most basic and technical level, every narrator is an unreliable narrator. A theoretically perfectly reliable narrator would explain absolutely everything that's happening, so the audience is fully briefed on the intricacies of the story, which is impossible, because at bare minimum, language itself isn't that precise, and broadly, it would just take way too long. There will always be room for confusion and interpretation, but aside from a certain baseline background radiation of unreliability, there are many ways for a narrator to be notably unreliable. It's generally expected that a narrator...
If a narrator is completely unbiased, then, I don't know, it feels weird, like story itself is biased. If a story is being, told by anyone, they're all biased in a way, right? If they go by, current standards of, I don't know, book standards of just saying, I don't know, this, you just, this is what I think, you take it on. If there is always like disclaimers like that every moment, they'll be really like take too much time, it would be so weird. So all storytellers and story itself will have biases in itself, I guess. So obviously that's a given, right? It's always a given, like if there is a topic of the story that is supposed to be subjective, I think audience can figure that out. An audience can realize that narrator is having his own take on it, I guess.
Or POV character is being honest and correct about what's happening, at least to the extent of their ability to understand it. But what happens when that's not true? Now, the convenient thing about this line of questioning is it actually takes us out of the prose-only zone. See, most mediums of storytelling don't have narrators, because most of them don't need narrators. In prose writing, the narrator is the only way for the story to set the stage, paint the picture of the setting for the audience, tell us how the characters look and act, and broadly, the only way for the story to communicate information to the audience that the characters themselves wouldn't immediately want to volunteer. If you want to get across to your audience that a character is a redhead with green eyes and freckles, unless that character feels like saying those things out loud, it's going to have to come through from the narrator. This stops being true as soon as a visual element is introduced to the story. So comics, picture books, shows, and movies don't need narration, and in fact often suffer from its inclusion, because audio narration can feel like a clumsy and abstract way to communicate plot beats in a visual medium. Without a narrator, it might seem difficult to have an unreliable narrator, but even in stories that don't have third-person narrators, you can have unreliable narration or an unreliable narrative, which is good because otherwise it would be really hard for me to put visual examples in this video. The easiest way to justify having an unreliable narrator in a non-prose medium is to have a character in the story tell a story. This character thus takes on the role of a first-person narrator for the benefit of the other characters in the story. This can be a framing sequence for an entire movie or a full episode of a show, where the story begins with a character starting their story and ends shortly after they finish. Maybe the characters are all sharing ghost stories around a campfire, or someone is being interrogated by the authorities about what they did for a recent heist or crime, or the characters are reading through another character's diary, or a movie opens with narration from an unseen, much older version of one of the characters we're about to meet, or maybe several characters are all weighing in on their side of the big story, Rashomon style. In these scenarios, the characters can all be expected to be biased by their personal eccentricities, and that means the writer can get a lot of mileage out of letting every character tell the story unreliably in a way that makes sense for them. We get to see how the characters Flanderize each other in their own exaggerated ways. If two characters dislike each other, the way they characterize...
Isn't narration supposed to be telling something of the story that you're watching from an outside voice? That is narration itself. If the story's character themselves telling story, that is part of the main story itself. Like that is the story that this character are telling story. That's not really narration, is it? The characters are telling a story. or, describing the events that might be false.
Each other is liable to be cartoonishly evil or cruel or otherwise hilariously out of character. A prideful egotist might tell a story where they're the heroic champion that single-handedly saved the day by fighting off a truly implausible number of bad guys. A villain might cast themselves as the victim. A parent might censor the swear words and steamy bits of a story they're telling their kid. A child's version of a story is liable to be a bit more unfocused than an adult's. This is a way to reinforce characterization while also giving the audience a fun mystery to puzzle through. What parts of the story are true? What parts are exaggerated? What really happened? In cases where only one character is telling the story, so we can't cross-reference with anyone else's version, we're often directed to take them at their word for the bulk of the runtime, only for doubt to be cast on them at the very end for a fun twist reveal. Maybe the happy ending they described was wishful thinking, or the story is revealed to be an elaborate lie. Broadly, there are three ways narrators can be unreliable. The first and most obvious is if they are lying liars. These narrators will flat out deceive characters and audiences alike by either misrepresenting events or leaving out key information, like for instance, and in those intervening 10 minutes, I totally killed that guy. The second type are ignorant or inattentive. These narrators aren't intentionally misrepresenting the story, but they don't really understand what's going on, so their version of events might skip past key details they've missed and be broadly not very useful. This is most common in story-within-a-story settings because it can easily be played for comedy if the narrator chooses to focus on a
I think the ignorant one is more common than plain out lying, because the lying narrators have to be much clever, otherwise audience will be pissed off. Like, what the fuck was that type of thing? Ignorant one is kind of makes sense. Like, the narrator is one of the characters, that's how it usually goes. And even they don't know the end of the story, so probably miss something because they're not omniscient, let's just say. So by the end of it, even they are surprised, even in their narration, right? So yeah, that is more common than the lying. Lying has to be really clever, and in the end has to show like all this narration was part of the story to begin with. Something like that.
Seemingly incidental detail while extremely significant things are happening in the background. And the third type is hallucinatory. These narrators are also not intentionally misrepresenting the story most of the time, but their actual perception of reality is unreliable because the way they perceive their surroundings is not how they're really happening. This works quite well in visual mediums because the camera can show what the character is perceiving with subtle hints that it's not exactly bound by physical laws or shot continuity. Unreliable narration can also be used for dramatic irony if the character narrates a situation playing out one way while the audience sees it play out differently, presumably how it really happened, giving the audience information that the characters hearing the story don't have. A character might describe themselves as totally in control of their life, while the camera treacherously reveals them to be a hot mess. In contrast, a character might also describe themselves as lame or uncool or broadly disliked, only for the objective...
Wait a minute, was the Spider-Man scene where he was fat? Isn't the Spider-Man's whole thing is that his metabolism is ridiculously high? How the fuck did he get fat? What did he eat? I mean... Isn't his metabolism supposed to be like tens of thousands of calories?
POV to show them surrounded by people who like and value them, and only their insecurities are making them tell the story that way. This is again used to highlight the character and their unique traits. The way they tell a story tells us something useful about this character, how their own perceptions color reality, and how honest they're willing to be with themselves or the people around them. This is very useful stuff, but the versions we've been discussing have all been safely compartmentalized in a story within a story, and used for the purpose of highlighting a character's unique wackiness.
Yeah, I think the gritty detective style 90s, like, anybody played Max Payne, the game, second one? I think, yeah, second one. I remember second one very detailed. I played it in 90s, I guess. Also very little, I still remember it. Something like that, like old comic book style, gritty, black and white type of thing, but detective doesn't really speak, but narrates things. Everything that he's feeling, he's talking, what happened to the story, what he's gonna do. I guess something like that.
In the way they specifically see the world and tell their story. In these scenarios, we typically trust that the camera outside that story within a story is still going to be honest with us about what's really going on. This is not always true, and that's where things can start getting complicated. When an unreliable narrator has control over the entire story, things start getting dicey. In general, an audience will start a story trusting that the story is not lying to them. It likely isn't telling them everything. Even an omniscient perspective typically keeps the camera pointed away from the really juicy reveals, but the audience generally trusts that what they're seeing is what's really happening. They don't go into a story assuming the story is going to lie to them. However, there are ways a writer can clue in the audience that they should start being suspicious. Maybe characters are acting strangely or inconsistently, or backgrounds are shifting in ways that don't make sense, or continuity errors are cropping up between shots. An audience might begin to get suspicious, and will generally have those...
Yeah, omniscient narrators can deliberately keep things because they can imply that they're telling a story, so this is information not for now. and imply something like, or is it, or something like that, to imply to the audience like something's not right, right? So narrator's not really lying, but keeping things, because story is not there yet, right? When it reaches certain point, it will reveal, narrator will reveal the whatever the thing is.
Suspicions confirmed fairly soon after the evidence piles up. The suspicious scene might be revealed to be a dream, or a simulation, or a hallucination, or somebody's mind palace, or a brief glimpse into an alternate timeline, or any number of plot-based hand-wavy justifications the writers can use to briefly bait and switch the audience with an impossible or deeply unlikely scenario. This can be a lot of fun, but it has a detrimental effect on audience investment in the long term. If they've already done the nightmare sequence or the holodeck training program trick enough times, the audience might start feeling broadly unworried when a situation looks particularly perilous, because it's even odds it's not even really happening. This means when it turns out to actually be happening, the audience has to play catch-up on their investment. And unfortunately, if the audience has picked up on clever clues that the scenario was fake, like the writing making no sense or continuity errors in the shot, that goes from being very cool and smart writing to subtly hint that the events aren't really happening, to the unfortunate realization that it's actually just bad writing and poor set management. It's a risk happening to the unfortunate realization that it's actually...
Why Sherlock fans thought there was a secret season 4 episode. Did Sherlock have a secret final episode that never aired? Is the origin of the theory, and what really... Sherlock is like... Look, I love that series, but to me it feel like, I don't know, if you want to make movie, but holy shit, those episodes were really spaced out. Like, took a long fucking time just to make few episodes. And like, by the last season, I had to rewatch all the first ones because they were much spaced out. Like, I understand that these actors are really busy and it takes time, but geez. And also, by the end season, it was becoming way too confusing, right? Even I had to like really focus, right, to what the fuck is going on. Sherlock's last season, I guess season before that as well, was one of those where you have to be completely focused if you want to watch that episode. If you just want to chill, do not watch that.
Just bad writing and poor set management. It's a risky trope to overuse because it hits with less punch every time and diminishes the punch of the actual non-fake plot twists. And it can train an audience to pick apart your writing looking for clues, which is of course a good and fun thing for any audience to do, but it can be a bit disheartening for the writer regardless. But of course, one easy way to avoid that issue is to tell only one self-contained story, like a standalone book or movie, and having that turn out to be an unreliable narrative, because that means that there aren't later installments for the audience to disbelieve. One relatively common way this plays out is a reveal near the end of the story that the POV character has been hallucinating for large portions of it, and whole scenes didn't happen or didn't play out the way they thought they did. Or a character's memories have specifically been tinkered with, and any flashbacks and recollections they had aren't what they seemed to be. These reveals usually hit late in the game and make a lot more sense on a second viewing, where the audience can be on the lookout for particularly exciting hints at the break in reality.
Yeah, but that only happens with the first or second person thing, not with the third person. Third person lying has to be really clever, like I said, otherwise it doesn't work.
Of course, once you establish the idea that the POV character's perceptions can't be trusted, on a certain level that's kinda game over. For the purposes of this story, the audience can no longer be convinced that anything they're seeing is real. It has a similarly disengaging effect to the all-a-dream twist, since it confirms that the story can and will pull the rug out from under the audience, and it's pretty much impossible to take anything the story presents at face value anymore. Most of the time, this is a feature and not a bug, since this reveal usually hits when the story is already almost over, and it can be very cool for an audience to go back through a story like that and catch all the hints and double meanings they missed the first time through. If the story doesn't have to convince the audience...
On the topic of hallucinations, something not being true, I still remember Inception and the last scene where he spins that thing, right? And by the end of it, kind of wobbles and the scene cuts. I guess we are supposed to assume that maybe he, is back to reality, or maybe he's still stuck in Inception and he didn't get to London, whatever, with his kid or whatever, right? I don't like endings like that, right? Like, it's either happy ending or everything's fucked. We don't know. Like, a story has that kind of an open ending, which could be anything, kind of panics me. Like, everything turns fine, suddenly shows something, it's still a hallucination, and then it's just like end credits. So what the fuck? It's like, what are we supposed to make our own minds? That's just so fucked up.
Audience that they're seeing something that's really definitely happening, it isn't a problem that they basically can't convince them anymore. But this can become an issue in serialized media or other long-form storytelling, because if the story gets too comfortable playing with the audience's perceptions of reality, then as mentioned, the audience is going to disinvest. And if the writing gets too shoddy, the audience might literally refuse to believe it's actually happening. The problem is only worsened if the writer gets cute with it, as they so often do, like having a character snap out of a horrifying unreality into a scene scene where they're being rescued, which in turn dissolves into a horrifying unreality until they wake up to being rescued again, but for real this time. It's pretty understandable that both the characters and the audience might have a little trouble believing the story is actually ending the way it says it is. And unfortunately, just like in all a dream scenarios, this is technically an interpretation that could be applied to literally any story ever. The idea that a story is being told by an unreliable narrator lying to the audience is technically always true, because the writer is lying to the audience by telling them a story in the first place. This is one of those foundational elements of storytelling, like the fourth wall, where if the writer starts poking at it too hard, it can destabilize the storytelling process itself. It's literally an attack on suspension of disbelief. In order to fully enjoy a story, an audience can't be too hung up on the fact that the story doesn't necessarily make 100% sense or isn't 100% convincing in the effects department. The story could be critiqued or nitpicked for errors or speculative fantasy that doesn't necessarily make sense, but doing so damages the audience's ability to take the story at face value. So when an audience suspends their disbelief, they're choosing not to do that in order to remain immersed in the story. This is why things can get tricky when the story tells the audience that they should have been disbelieving them the whole time because actually the story was a lie. It can be an exciting and unusual approach to storytelling because it directly encourages the audience to critically examine what they're seeing rather than taking the characters at face value. But if they take that far enough, or rather if the writer directs them to take that far enough, the audience's ability to stay immersed can be deeply compromised. In the end, the audience won't know when to trust the story, and if the story does something they dislike, they might choose to believe that it was a lie too. If the author makes too much of their story a canonical lie, they lose the ability to control the audience's belief in what they're telling them. So, yeah.
Yep. These are all interesting point. Yeah, unreliable narrators. These narrators are also one of those things that you need to approach very carefully when telling a story. Usually it's like vanilla generic thing, like narrators knows everything. It's if his third person knows everything, will deliberately not tell you something other than lying, just you'll find out later type of thing. But yeah, lies one thing, or lies or deception. These are the one thing that, they have to really tackle it very carefully, because like she said, after that it's just like everything's gonna be, audience will not believe anything, even the ending, right? And they live happily ever after. Really? After you lied to me 3-4 times, I'm not supposed to believe that? Yeah, that inception thing is really fucked up. That's not narrator part, but still, like that confusion thing, right? Like, is the end reality? He's still stuck in inception. That's just fucked up. But yeah. Alright, well, that was Trope Talk, Unreliable Narrators by channel Sarcastic production. If you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe. Yeah, I'll see you next time.